The moment Letitia Rourke planted her boots in the center of Caldwell's Main Street and crossed her arms over her chest, every man in that dusty Kansas town in the summer of 1878 knew they were dealing with a woman who did not bend easily. The town of Caldwell sat just north of the Indian Territory line, and it had a reputation for being rough at the edges. Cattle drives pushed through it like rivers through a canyon, leaving behind mud and noise and men with too much money and not enough sense. The Santa Fe Railroad had made it both prosperous and dangerous, and the sheriff, a heavy-jowled man named Beaumont Hicks, had taken it upon himself to assign escorts to any woman traveling alone through his jurisdiction. It was, he claimed, for their protection. Letitia Rourke had other words for it. She was 24 years old, a schoolteacher from Wichita who had come to Caldwell to assume a teaching post at the newly built schoolhouse at the edge of town. She had traveled most of the way by rail, then the last stretch by stagecoach, and she had managed perfectly well without a keeper for every single mile of that journey. She was not about to start accepting one now just because a sheriff with a belly full of self-importance had decided that women needed managing. The escort in question was a man named Dallin Burke. He was wide in the shoulders and loud in the voice, and he smelled powerfully of bay rum and something less pleasant beneath it. He had tipped his hat at her with an expression that was less respectful and more proprietary, and when he had reached for her traveling trunk without so much as asking, she had stepped between him and her luggage and told him, in the clearest terms she could manage, that she would not be needing his services. "Ma'am," Sheriff Hicks had said, his thumbs hooked in his belt, "it is simply a matter of courtesy. A woman alone in Caldwell needs a reliable man to see her to her destination. It is not a slight on your capabilities. It is simply how things are done here." "How things are done here is not how things ought to be done," Letitia had replied, and the small crowd that had gathered near the freight office shifted uncomfortably. "I have a trunk, 2 valises, and a perfectly good pair of legs. I know where the schoolhouse is. I do not require a man to supervise my walking." Burke made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a snort. "She is a feisty one," he said to Hicks, as though Letitia were not standing 3 feet in front of him. "I can handle feisty." "You will not be handling anything of mine," Letitia said, and the coldness in her voice was the kind that could stop a fire in its tracks. That was when Chester Shelby moved. He had been leaning against the post of the freight office, his hat low against the afternoon sun, a quiet man who had been loading his wagon with feed sacks and had no particular reason to insert himself into someone else's disagreement. He was 30 years old, lean and weathered in the way that a man gets when he has spent years working honest land, with dark hair and eyes the color of creek water after a rain, a kind of gray-green that shifted depending on the light. He had heard the whole exchange, and he had said nothing for the duration of it, which in itself made him unusual among the assembled men. He stepped forward, and he was not loud about it. He did not push Burke aside or make any great show. He simply stepped between the group and Letitia, though not in the way Burke had, not blocking her or crowding her space. He turned to the sheriff first. "Hicks," he said, and his voice was calm, and even the way a man speaks when he does not need to raise it to be heard, "seems to me the lady has made herself clear." "Chester, stay out of this," Hicks said. "This is town business." "I have a farm 3 miles east," Chester said. "I pass right by the schoolhouse on my way home. If this lady wants company on the walk, she can have mine. If she does not want company, then she does not need any. Either way, Dallin Burke is going nowhere near her." Burke straightened up at that. "And who made you the deciding vote, Shelby?" Chester looked at Burke for a long moment. "Nobody," he said, "which is exactly the point." He turned then and he looked directly at Letitia, and what she saw in his expression was something she had not expected to find on a main street in Caldwell. It was respect, plain, uncomplicated, and utterly sincere. "Ma'am," he said, "I apologize for all of this. I am going east with my wagon in about 10 minutes. You are welcome to walk alongside it if you like. I will not carry your bags unless you ask me to. I will not talk unless you want conversation." And if you would rather go alone, I will tip my hat and mind my own business. Your choice, entirely." Letitia looked at him for a long moment. She was not a woman who made quick judgments based on appearances, but she was a woman who had spent years reading people, and what she read in Chester Shelby was something honest. Not performed for an audience, honest, genuinely honest. "What is your name?" she asked. "Chester Shelby. And your farm is truly east of here?" "Yes, ma'am, 3 miles past the schoolhouse, about a quarter-mile off the main road." She looked at Burke, then at Hicks, and then back at Chester. "I will walk alongside your wagon," she said, "and I will carry my own bags." "As you like," he said, and he turned back to his feed sacks without another word. Sheriff Hicks sputtered. "This is highly irregular," he said. "So is assigning escorts to grown women without their consent," Letitia replied, and she picked up her valise in each hand and left him standing in the street. The afternoon was hot and golden, the kind of Kansas summer afternoon that has a quality of light like polished copper, and the road east out of Caldwell was dry and flat, and lined with the low grass that rippled in the wind like something breathing. Chester walked his horses slowly, and he had not been lying about going at her pace. The wagon rolled alongside her at exactly the speed she was walking, and for the first several minutes neither of them said a word. It was Letitia who broke the silence, and she did it because she was someone who found prolonged silence in the presence of another person both interesting and slightly unbearable when there were things she was curious about. "Why did you do that?" she asked. Chester considered the question seriously, which she noticed. He did not brush it off or give her something easy. "Because Burke is not a good man," he said. "And because you were clearly capable of managing your situation. But having the sheriff assigned against you is different from just a man on the street. Hicks has authority. I thought it might help to have someone with a bit of standing offer you a different option." "And you have standing in Caldwell?" she asked, not with mockery but with genuine curiosity. "Some," he said. "I have been here 12 years. I own my land outright. People around here tend to leave me alone, and I tend to leave them alone. That has some value occasionally." "That is a very sensible way to live," she said. "I find it suits me," he agreed. They walked a little further, the wagon creaking, the horses steady. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the grass and then was quiet. Letitia shifted one of her valises to the other hand. "You can put that in the wagon bed," Chester said. "I am not carrying it, I am just offering the space." She almost smiled. She placed the valise in the wagon bed, and it sat there between the feed sacks, and she felt slightly better for it. "I am Letitia Rourke," she said. "I know," he said. "Caldwell is not a large town. Word travels about new teachers. The children have been talking about it for 2 weeks." "What have they been saying?" "They have been wondering if you will be strict," he said, and now there was the faintest suggestion of amusement in his voice. "The last teacher was not, and they ran wild." "I am strict," she said, "about the things that matter. I am not strict about the things that do not." "That sounds about right," he said. She glanced at him. "Do you have children?" There was a pause, and in that pause she felt something shift very slightly in the atmosphere between them. "No," he said. "I have not. I have a farm, 2 horses, 4 dogs, and more chickens than any one person needs." She waited for him to say something about a wife, and he did not. She decided not to ask. Not yet. The schoolhouse came into view after about 20 minutes of walking, a modest white-painted building with 2 windows on each side and a small bell tower that was mostly decorative. There was a house attached to one end of it, the teacher's quarters, which was smaller than anything Letitia had expected but was also, she thought, exactly enough. "This is you," Chester said, pulling the horses to a stop. She lifted her valise from the wagon bed. He climbed down and retrieved her trunk from the back, setting it on the ground beside the steps without ceremony. She had not asked him to, but the trunk was genuinely heavy, and she was not foolish enough to refuse help when it was offered without any strings attached. "Thank you," she said, "for the walk and for this." "No trouble," he said. He picked up his hat brim and settled it again. A small gesture that she would come to learn was something he did when he was thinking. "If you need anything, Mrs. Rourke, the nearest help east of here is my farm." I am usually in the fields before 7 and home by dark." "Miss Rourke," she said, "I am not married." He looked at her, and there was nothing in his expression beyond a simple acknowledgment of the correction. "Miss Rourke," he said, "good evening." "Good evening, Mr. Shelby," she said. He climbed back onto the wagon, clicked to the horses, and moved east down the road, and she stood in front of the schoolhouse and watched him go until the wagon was small in the distance, and then she turned and went inside. She spent that first evening unpacking, settling her books onto the shelves in the small living quarters, hanging her dresses on the iron hooks behind the door, and making a small supper from the provisions the school board had left for her arrival. She was not someone who needed a great deal to be comfortable, and the house, small as it was, had a clean simplicity that she found she liked. There was a window that faced west, and she watched the sky go from copper to rose to a deep blue-purple that eventually consumed everything, and she thought about the day, and about Caldwell, and about the strange, quiet man who had stepped forward on that street and offered her nothing more and nothing less than exactly what she needed. She was in her classroom the following morning well before 7, and she was there still when she heard the sound of a wagon on the road outside. She looked up from the slates she was arranging and saw Chester Shelby's wagon moving east, and he lifted a hand as he passed without looking toward the window, which meant he had simply made a habit of the gesture, acknowledging the schoolhouse as he passed. She did not know why that small thing moved her as much as it did. School started on a Monday in late August, and Letitia had 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 15. They were a mixed group in temperament, some eager and attentive, some restless and inclined to disruption, one or two who had clearly been told by older siblings to give the new teacher a hard time and see what happened. She handled them with a combination of warmth and complete unflappability that had the intended effect within the first 2 days. By the end of the first week, she had them all, even the difficult ones. The town of Caldwell, in its way, was beginning to accept her also. She was not the kind of person who forced acceptance, but she was steady and capable, and the residents could see it. She traded at the general store run by a man named Hosea Pratt and his wife Clara, who was perhaps the most enthusiastic source of local information that Letitia had yet encountered. Clara Pratt knew everything about everyone in a 20-mile radius and dispensed this information freely and without malice. It was Clara who told her about Chester Shelby. "He came to Caldwell in '66, Clara said one afternoon in early September, wrapping a block of soap in paper and handing it across the counter. "Built that farm from nothing but dry grass and stubbornness. He was married once. Her name was Alice. She died of fever in '69, about 2 years after they were married. Broke him up something terrible. He kept to himself after that. Works his land, does his business in town, goes home. He is a good man, Chester, just a quiet one. He was kind to me when I arrived," Letitia said. Clara smiled at her with the particular knowing expression of a woman who has watched a small town long enough to see patterns. "Yes," she said, "he was." Letitia thought about what Clara had told her on the walk back to the schoolhouse. She thought about a man who had built something from nothing and lost the person he had built it with, and who had continued anyway, because what else do you do? She thought that kind of grief had a way of making people either harder or quieter, and Chester Shelby had gone the quiet route, which she thought was the braver one. She saw him on his way past that afternoon, and this time she was outside, sweeping the front steps, and they exchanged a proper greeting. "Good afternoon," he said, slowing the horses. "Good afternoon. How is the farm today?" "It is always something," he said, with that slight edge of dry humor she was beginning to recognize as his default register. "Fence post on the north side gave out. Spent the morning in the sun reminding it of its obligations." She laughed, and it was a genuine laugh, the kind that surprised her by coming out. "Did it listen?" "It is back in the ground," he said, "which I am choosing to interpret as yes." She smiled at him. He looked at her the way he had looked at her on the main street, that direct and quietly respectful look, and then he tipped his hat and moved the horses on east. The weather shifted in October, the way it does on the Kansas plains, abruptly and with complete authority. The warmth bled out of the days and the wind took on an edge, and the grass went from gold to the color of pale straw. Letitia had discovered by then that the winters in Caldwell were not gentle, and she had begun to prepare accordingly, stacking wood beside the schoolhouse, layering extra blankets on her narrow bed. She had also, without particularly intending to, begun to see Chester Shelby on a more regular basis. It had started with a practical matter. One of the fence boards along the schoolhouse property had splintered during a windstorm, and she had mentioned it to Clara at the store, and Clara had mentioned it in that off-handed way she had that was not actually off-handed at all. And 2 days later Chester had appeared with planks and a hammer and repaired it in under an hour while she was teaching. She had come out at the lunch hour to find it done, and he was loading his tools back into the wagon. "You did not have to do that," she said. "The school board should have done it," he said. "They did not. It needed doing." "Will you come inside for some coffee?" she asked. "I have a pot on." He hesitated for just a moment, and she could see him deciding something. "If it is no trouble," he said. "I offered," she said. So he came inside, and he sat at the small table in her kitchen quarters with his hat in his hands, and she poured coffee into 2 cups, and they talked. Properly talked, the way 2 people talk when they are genuinely interested in each other. She asked him about his farm, about what he grew, about how he had come to Kansas from Virginia, where she had gathered he was originally from. He told her about the years after the war, about looking west and deciding that starting fresh was the only thing that made any sense, about finding the land east of Caldwell, and knowing it was right in the particular way you know certain things without being able to fully explain them. She told him about Wichita, about her parents who had both passed within a year of each other when she was 19, about putting herself through teachers' training on determination and very little else, about deciding to come to Caldwell because it was new, and because she had learned that new places suited her better than ones with too many old shadows in them. When he left an hour later, something between them had settled into a different shape, not romantic, not yet, but honest. The kind of honest that precedes everything else. November arrived with the first real cold, and the cattle drives had thinned out, and Caldwell settled into its quieter winter self. Letitia had her routine, and she was comfortable in it. She taught her students. She read her books by lamplight in the evenings. She went to church on Sundays at the small Methodist congregation in town, and she had her coffee hour with Chester on Fridays, which had become a standing arrangement without either of them formally naming it as such. He would come by on Fridays after finishing his morning work, and she would have coffee waiting, and they would sit at the kitchen table and talk, and more often the talking stretched well past an hour. He was, she discovered over these weeks, a man of considerable intelligence and surprising depth, someone who read widely and thought carefully and had opinions that he held with conviction, but not with the sort of rigid certainty that made conversation into argument. She liked the way he listened, which was with his full attention, not the half-listening of someone forming their rebuttal while you were still speaking, but the real kind, the kind that made you feel heard. She also noticed, in the gradual and helpless way that you notice such things, that he was very handsome. Not in the theatrical way of men who knew they were handsome, but in the quiet, lived-in way of a man whose face showed what he had been through and was better for it. There was something about his hands that she particularly noticed, which she acknowledged to herself was a very odd thing to particularly notice. But they were good hands, steady and capable, and they moved with a kind of deliberateness that was consistent with everything else about him. She mentioned none of this to Clara Pratt, who was already watching her with the expression of someone who was very patiently waiting for a story to develop. The incident that changed things happened on a Thursday evening in late November, And it was one of those incidents that reshapes everything by being both small and significant at once. Letitia had stayed late at the schoolhouse grading writing exercises by lamplight, and she had not noticed how fully dark it had gotten outside. And when she put on her coat to take the short walk to the necessary facilities at the back of the property, she stepped outside to find that a light snow had begun to fall, and that Dallin Burke was standing at the edge of the property line. He was not threatening her directly. He was simply standing there, which was threat enough. She had heard from Clara that Burke had made a series of remarks in the saloon about Letitia's refusal of his escort, remarks that had been entirely unpleasant, and that had characterized her refusal as something other than what it was. She had ignored these reports because she was not going to let a mean-spirited man's opinion of her govern her behavior, but standing in the cold dark with him watching her from the edge of the lamplight was a different matter. "Good evening, Miss Rourke," Burke said. "Mr. Burke," she said, and her voice was steady because she would not let him see that her heart had lurched. "Is there something I can help you with?" "I was just thinking," he said, "that you might reconsider your position on the Escort situation. Nights like this, a woman alone out here, it is not safe." "I am on my own property," she said. "Good night." She went back inside and she bolted the door and she sat at the kitchen table for a long moment collecting herself. Then she made a decision, which was that she was going to handle this herself, and the first step was telling someone. Not because she could not handle it, but because there was a difference between independence and isolation, and she knew the difference. She wrote a brief note and addressed it to Chester Shelby, because he was the person she trusted most in Caldwell, and she walked the note to the Pratt General Store in the morning before school and asked Clara to send it with the next wagon east. He appeared at her door that same afternoon, still in his work coat, which meant he had come directly from the field. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the directness of the question, the simple, genuine concern of it, did something to her composure that she immediately worked to reassemble. "I am fine," she said, and told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I will speak to Hicks," he said. "I do not want to make a scene of it," she said. "I know," he said, "but Hicks needs to know Burke is being a fool near the schoolhouse. That is not about you needing protection. That is about Burke needing to be told that Caldwell has limits." He looked at her. "Will you trust me to handle it quietly?" She considered him. "Yes," she said, "I will." He did handle it quietly, though she did not know exactly what was said. What she did know was that Burke left Caldwell 3 weeks later with a cattle outfit headed for Texas, and Sheriff Hicks stopped her on the street one afternoon in December to tell her that he hoped she was settling in well, and that the schoolhouse was looking very fine, which was the closest he was going to get to an apology, and she took it as such. Chester came for his Friday coffee that week, and she put a slice of dried apple cake on the table alongside the coffee, and he looked at it and then at her, and she said, "Thank you, Chester," and he understood everything she meant by it, which was considerably more than 2 words would usually carry. "It was nothing," he said, and the way he said it meant it had not been nothing at all, only that he was not going to make her feel indebted for it. She put her hand on the table between them, not on his hand, just near it, a gesture. He looked at it for a moment, and then he looked up at her, and there it was, the thing that had been building since August in the gold afternoon air on the road east of Caldwell. It was not a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. He reached out and covered her hand with his, briefly, the lightest possible pressure. And then he picked up his coffee cup, and neither of them said anything about it, and yet everything was completely different. December in Caldwell was cold and still, the kind of winter that felt permanent though she knew it was not. The school had a small Christmas celebration that she organized with all 14 students, and the parents came, and Chester came too because she had invited him, and because he was also, in a roundabout way, the unofficial patron of the schoolhouse fence, which she had designated as sufficient justification. She watched him across the room talking to the parents of one of her students, a quiet and easy conversation, and she saw the way the children gravitated toward him without seeming to realize they were doing it, which told her something important about him that no conversation had communicated as directly. He caught her watching and raised his eyebrows slightly, a small questioning expression, and she shook her head a little to indicate nothing is wrong. I am just looking, and he accepted this with a small nod and went back to his conversation, but there was a quality to his bearing afterward that was different. Aware of her in the room. Aware of her in the particular way of someone who is paying closer attention than they are letting on. After the celebration, when the families had gone home and she was tidying the classroom by lamplight, she heard a knock at the door and opened it to find him on the step with his hat in his hands and the snow falling lightly behind him. I thought I would help you close up, he said. You do not have to, she said. I know, he said. May I? She stepped back and let him in, and they closed up the classroom together, stacking the small chairs and banking the stove, and working in a companionable silence that was its own kind of intimacy. When it was done, he was putting on his coat to go, and she was standing in the doorway between the classroom and her quarters, and she said, Chester, and he stopped. He turned and looked at her, and the lamplight was warm between them, and she thought that there were moments in your life when you were standing at a door that you could either walk through or walk away from, and you had to decide, and she had always been someone who walked through. I am glad you stepped forward that day, she said. When I arrived. I was glad then, and I am more glad now. He held her gaze, and something in his expression opened in the way of someone removing something they have been carrying a long time. So am I, he said, more than I can easily say. You do not have to say it easily, she said. He crossed the room in 3 steps and stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the snowflakes that had not yet melted in his hair, and he looked at her with that direct, honest, undefended look that was the most characteristic thing about him, and said, I have not felt anything like this in a very long time, Letitia. I wanted you to know that. She reached up and touched his jaw with her fingers, just for a moment, feeling the roughness of it. I know, she said. He turned his face slightly into her hand, the smallest and most unguarded thing, and then he stepped back and put his hat on and said good night, and she stood in the doorway and listened to his wagon move east in the snow, and she was smiling so hard her face ached. Winter deepened into January and February, and Caldwell hunkered down against it the way all plains towns do, with firewood and patience and the knowledge that spring always comes eventually. Letitia and Chester moved into the landscape of something that was unmistakably, irrevocably a courtship. He came on Fridays still, but also sometimes on Wednesdays, and when the snow was heavy, he brought firewood and stacked it without being asked, and she started making supper instead of just coffee, and they ate together at her small kitchen table and talked about everything under the sun with the ease of people for whom conversation had never been difficult. He told her about Virginia, about his family, about his 2 brothers who had gone different directions after the war, one dead, one living somewhere in Colorado. He told her about Alice in a way that was not painful to listen to because he told it like someone who had made peace with grief, not someone who was over it exactly, but someone who had integrated it into who they were. He had loved her, and she had died, and he had gone on, and going on did not mean forgetting. He said all of this plainly and quietly, and she sat with it, and she said, she sounds like she was someone worth loving, and he looked at her with an expression that was almost grateful. She told him about the things she had not told many people. About the loneliness of those years after her parents died, about the stubbornness that had gotten her through them, and the occasional moments when stubbornness alone was not quite enough. About why she had chosen teaching, which was not a noble reason but a true one, that she found children's minds genuinely interesting, and that she liked being in rooms where people were learning things, where you could watch someone understand something for the first time, and it had a particular light to it. He listened to all of it with that quality of attention that she had come to rely on, and she realized somewhere in the middle of February that he had become the most important person in her daily life without her particularly having arranged it. which was, she thought, how the important things usually happened. He asked her to walk with him on a Sunday afternoon in early March when the weather had eased enough to make walking pleasant. Not the road east, but across the fields to the east of the schoolhouse, where the land was beginning to show the first hesitant green of early spring, and the sky was the pale blue of something newly washed. They walked side by side, close enough that their arms occasionally touched, and he had his hands in his coat pockets, and she had her hands in her muff, and they were quiet for a stretch of time that was entirely comfortable. "I want to show you the farm," he said. She looked at him. "I would like to see it," she said. "Not just a visit," he said, and then he stopped walking, and she stopped with him, and he turned to face her, and she saw the particular quality of his expression that meant he was going to say something that mattered and was not going to waste words on it. "Letitia, I am asking if you would consider making it your home. I am asking if you would consider marrying me." The prairie around them was enormously quiet. A killdeer called somewhere far off. The light was thin and beautiful. She did not make him wait. She was not someone who made people wait for kindness when she had it to give. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Chester." He took a breath that had something of relief in it, which told her he had been more uncertain than he had let on, and she found that deeply endearing. He took her hands from her muff and held them in both of his, and looked at her with the full, unguarded version of that expression she had been watching build in him since December, and she felt it in the center of her chest like something clicking into place. He kissed her gently in the middle of that March field, with the green coming up around their boots and the wide Kansas sky above them, and it was exactly the right kiss for two people who had been taking their time about things, which is to say it was unhurried and certain and meant it. They were married in April at the Methodist Church in Caldwell, and Clara Pratt cried and made no apologies for it, and Sheriff Hicks attended and shook Chester's hand with the good grace of a man who had come to understand that he had not always been right, and the 14 children of Letitia's school presented her with a painted wooden sign that read School of Miss Letitia Rourke, which she kept even after she was Mrs. Shelby, because she did not see any reason to change it. The ceremony was simple, and the celebration afterward was held in the churchyard, which was warm enough in April to be pleasant, and Chester danced with her to the fiddle and guitar that someone had produced from somewhere, and he was not a graceful dancer, but he was an earnest one, and she liked that considerably better. They drove home to the farm in the wagon as the sun was going down, and the farm was everything she had expected from his descriptions, and also more than she had expected, because descriptions do not capture the way a place feels when you understand it is now yours. The house was solid and well built, 2 stories with a broad front porch, and the fields around it were the particular dark Kansas earth that promised, and the evening was warm and full of frogs singing from the creek at the eastern edge of the property. He helped her down from the wagon, and she stood in front of the house and looked at it, and then looked at him and said, "It is a good home." "It is better now," he said simply. The spring of 1879 was a good one on the Shelby farm. The winter wheat came up well, and the corn they planted in May caught a series of rains at exactly the right time. Letitia kept her teaching position at the school, making the journey by wagon most mornings with Chester on his way to market or the store, and on days when her hours ran long, he always came back for her, always on time, always with that quiet, steady reliability that she had come to understand was not just a trait but a form of devotion. She put a kitchen garden in behind the house, and he built her raised beds from lumber he shaped himself, and she grew tomatoes and beans and herbs, and the chickens that he had so abundantly came to regard her with the particular suspicious respect of animals who are not quite sure what to make of a new presence but have decided to tolerate it. She loved the farm with a completeness that surprised her, given how thoroughly she had identified herself as a town person. There was something about the openness of it, the sense of the sky being genuinely present rather than just glimpsed between buildings, that answered a need in her she had not known she had. She would sometimes go out at dusk just to stand on the porch and look at the darkening horizon, and Chester would come and stand beside her with his coffee, and they would watch the stars come out, and she thought that this was one of those versions of happiness that you do not recognize immediately because it is too quiet and consistent to announce itself. There were difficulties, as there always are. The summer of 1879 brought a drought that was not catastrophic, but was genuinely worrying, and Chester spent several anxious weeks managing irrigation from the creek and making careful calculations about the corn yield, and Letitia watched him work with the intensity of someone who genuinely loved what he did, and she helped where she could and stayed out of the way where she could not, and at the end of it the harvest was short but workable, and they were all right. There were also the broader difficulties of the time and place. The cattle drives through Caldwell brought a rough population that the town managed with varying degrees of success, and 1879 was a year when Caldwell was genuinely violent in stretches, with shootings in the saloon district that were not uncommon, and a particular incident in August involving a dispute over a cattle brand that resulted in the death of a drover from Texas, and a great deal of legal complication for the town. Letitia was not close to any of this, but she was aware of it, and she was aware too of the realities faced by people who had less protection than she did. The Mexican drovers who were underpaid and overworked, the freedmen who had come west after Reconstruction, found its limits, and who lived in a narrow margin between the prejudices of the people around them. She noticed these things because she was someone who noticed them, and she talked to Chester about them, and he talked back, which was one of the things she loved about him, that he did not dismiss what she saw. She had a particular student that year, a girl named Rosa, daughter of a Mexican vaquero who worked one of the local outfits, who was fiercely intelligent and deeply shy, and who had initially not been welcome in the school in the way that was unspoken but clear. Letitia had handled that with the same calm directness she handled everything, which was to treat Rosa exactly as she treated every other student, which was to say with complete respect and high expectations, and to make it very plainly understood that she would not tolerate otherwise in her classroom. By October, Rosa was reading 3 grades ahead of where she had started, and Letitia was quietly furious on her behalf at every obstacle the world outside that classroom put in her path. Chester listened to her talk about Rosa one evening over supper and said, "You are going to make a difference for that child." "I am going to try," she said. "I am not sure one schoolteacher in one Kansas town is quite enough to fix everything that is wrong." "One is where it starts," he said. She looked at him across the table and felt the full and particular weight of loving someone who thought carefully about the world. "I know," she said. In October of 1879 she told him she was expecting their first child. She told him in the evening on the porch, in the same hour and light that had become their shared ritual, and she said it simply because there was no reason to be anything other than simple about it. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression that she had never seen on his face before, something that was almost overwhelmed, and then he reached over and took her hand and held it in both of his the way he had in that March field, and did not speak for a long moment. "Are you all right?" he asked, and the question had so many layers in it. Not just are you well, but are you happy about this? Are you frightened? Are you everything I hope you are? "I am wonderful," she said, and she meant all of it. He raised her hand and pressed his lips against it, a long and fervent pressure, and she felt that in her chest again, that click, that settling, that recognition. She put her free hand on his face, and he turned into it, and they stayed like that in the evening air with the stars coming up above the Kansas prairie and the frogs starting up from the creek. "I am going to be a father," he said softly, as though he was testing the reality of the words. "You are," she said. He looked at her with that full open expression and said, "I did not think I would have this. I had made peace with not having it." "You have it," she said. "I know," he said. "I know, Letitia." Their son was born in June of 1880, a healthy and considerably loud boy whom they named William James Shelby, after Chester's father James, and in acknowledgment of the grandfather he would never meet. He had Chester's gray-green eyes and Letitia's stubbornness, which was evident within his first weeks of life in the absolute conviction with which he expressed his opinions about hunger and comfort, and which delighted both his parents considerably. The farmhouse in June with a new baby was a different place than it had been, full of a particular kind of noise and warmth and exhaustion that Letitia had not anticipated and found she did not mind. Chester was, as she had expected from everything she knew about him, a devoted and practically capable father. He was not afraid of a baby the way some men seemed to be, did not treat William as though he might shatter, but held him with the same steady confidence he brought to everything, and the baby, perhaps recognizing something in that steadiness, generally settled quickly in his arms. Letitia nursed William and taught him her school until early September, when she returned to the classroom, and arranged for a woman from town named Mabel Cotter to care for William during school hours, an arrangement that she examined from every angle before accepting, not because she did not trust Mabel, but because she felt every dimension of what it meant to hand her child to someone else's care, and wanted to do it with full consciousness. Clara Pratt visited the farm for the first time that fall, having been invited repeatedly, and she sat in Letitia's kitchen with William on her lap and looked around at the neat and well-ordered and clearly deeply inhabited house, and then she looked at Letitia with an expression of uncomplicated satisfaction. "I knew," she said. "From the very first day you walked in my store, I knew you were someone who belonged here." "In Caldwell," Letitia said, amused. "On that farm," Clara said firmly. "With that man." Chester came in from the porch in time to hear the last part and raised his eyebrows at Letitia, and she smiled at him over Clara's head, and he shook his head slightly in the way of a man who has accepted that certain people will always know everything first. The years that followed had the quality of depth rather than drama, which is not to say they were without incident, but that the incidents existed within a framework of something so solid that they did not shake it. In 1881, the cattle drives began declining, and Caldwell started the slow process of transitioning away from being primarily a trail town. The Santa Fe line expanded, and with it came new families and new businesses, and the rougher element that had characterized the town in its peak years gradually dispersed, or was dispersed. Sheriff Hicks retired in 1882 and was replaced by a younger man named Carver who was more thoughtful and considerably more effective. Dahlen Burke, as far as anyone knew, had never come back from Texas. Chester expanded the farm in 1881, purchasing an adjacent section of land from a homesteader who had decided the plains were not for him after all, and he planted it with winter wheat and hired a hand named George Tillman, who was a freedman from Tennessee and a genuinely skilled farmer who became over the years something between an employee and a permanent fixture of the Shelby farm in the best possible sense. Chester paid him fairly, which was not universally done, and treated him with the straightforward respect he extended to everyone whose work and character warranted it. Letitia liked George enormously, and George, in his reserved and dignified way, seemed to return the sentiment. William grew with the wheat, it seemed, reaching his 3rd birthday in the summer of 1883 with the unstoppable energy of a child who had discovered the world, and found it entirely to his liking. He followed Chester around the farm with the single-minded dedication of someone in training for the most important job in the world, and Chester received this apprenticeship with a gravity that was only partially performed and mostly genuine. Their second child, a daughter they named Catherine Alice, was born in the spring of 1883. The Alice was Chester's quietly spoken tribute, and Letitia had been the one to suggest it when she saw how he looked when she proposed the name, that expression of someone being given something they had not expected and did not know how to ask for. Catherine was more placid than her brother had been as a baby, which her parents appreciated, and she had Letitia's dark hair and her father's quiet watchfulness, and she was loved with the same completeness that William was, which is to say without reservation. It was also in 1883 that Letitia had a conversation with the school board that had been building for some time. The school had outgrown its original building. The student population had grown as Caldwell grew, and they were now crowding nearly 30 children into a space built for 15. She had been making this case to the board for a year, and the board had been nodding and doing nothing, and she had finally decided that nods were not enough and had taken the matter to the broader town, organizing a meeting at the church at which she presented her case with the clarity and force of someone who had been a schoolteacher for 7 years and had long since ceased to be remotely intimidated by a committee of men. Chester sat in the back row of that meeting, not to advocate for her, because she did not need it and he knew it, but to be there, which was the kind of support she had come to understand was the best kind. He watched her dismantle every objection the board raised with a combination of patient reasoning and iron-willed persistence, and when she sat down to the most substantial applause the church hall had heard in recent memory, she looked back at him, and he was smiling the particular smile of someone who is proud in a way that is entirely without ego, proud in the way of someone who is simply glad to be in the presence of someone doing what they are built for. The new school building was approved and funded and opened in the fall of 1884. It had 4 windows on each side, a proper bell, and 2 classrooms, which meant a second teacher had to be hired, and Letitia oversaw that hiring process with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. The new teacher was a young woman named Helen, fresh from a teacher's college in St. Louis, who was smart and a little nervous, and very quickly not nervous at all under Letitia's mentorship. Rosa, who had been in Letitia's classroom years before, was by now working as a seamstress in town and sending money home to her parents, and she stopped by the new school on the day it opened to tell Miss Rourke, who was now very fully Mrs. Shelby, but was still Miss Rourke in that schoolhouse as far as anyone was concerned, that she had not forgotten what the classroom had meant to her. Letitia held both of Rosa's hands and told her that the classroom had been no more than what she deserved, and that the woman she had become was entirely her own doing. Rosa left with wet eyes and a straight back, which was, Letitia thought, exactly right. Chester came to collect her from the school that evening and found her sitting on the front steps alone in the last light, her hands folded in her lap. He sat down beside her without asking, which was the right thing to do, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Good day," he asked. "A very good day," she said. "One of the best." They sat there in the evening light for a while, the way they still did, watching the road and the grass and the wide pale sky, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and it was as natural as breathing. "Chester," she said after a while, he said, "do you remember that day in the street, when I arrived?" "I remember it clearly," he said. "I was so angry," she said. "I was furious. I had been on a stage for 4 hours and everything I owned was in a trunk and that man put his hands on my luggage without asking." "I remember," Chester said with a warmth of amusement. "I did not want any escort," she said. "I was so certain of that." "You were not wrong to be," he said. "I know," she said, "but I am glad you stepped forward anyway. I am glad you were the kind of man who could offer something without making it a condition." He held her a little closer. "I am glad I was paying enough attention to know what kind of offer to make," he said. She lifted her head and looked at him in the evening light, this man who had come east toward home on a summer afternoon and had stepped quietly into her life by stepping back from imposing on it. And she thought about all the ways a small decision can be the hinge point of everything that follows. "I love you," she said. It was not the first time she had said it, not remotely, but there were times when the words arrived with additional weight, when they were not just maintenance of the record but a full new declaration. This was one of those times. He looked at her with his whole self, which was the way Chester Shelby looked at things that mattered, and said, "I love you, Letitia." I have loved you since about the third Friday coffee, if I am being honest." "That early," she said. "You told me about why you became a teacher," he said, "and you used the phrase 'a particular light.' I thought, here is someone who sees things the way they are and still calls them beautiful. I have not been entirely steady on the subject since." She laughed and put her hand against his chest and felt his heartbeat, steady and reliable as everything else about him. "That is a very good thing to remember," she said. "I have a good memory for important things," he said. The summer of 1885 was hot but good, the kind of good that Kansas land sometimes produced, as if to remind you why you stayed, and the Shelby farm that year had its best harvest since Chester had worked the land. The winter wheat had been exceptional, and the corn had come in generous, and the kitchen garden behind the house was so productive that Letitia spent several August evenings putting up preserves, with a satisfaction that surprised her by being one of the year's better pleasures. William was 5 now, long-legged and curious and opinionated in ways that were clearly going to develop into something interesting, and Catherine was 2, still more observer than participant but watching everything with those gray-green Shelby eyes that missed nothing. Chester taught William the names of all the crops and the reasons behind the planting schedules and the logic of irrigation, and William absorbed all of it with an earnestness that made George Tillman, who taught him how to properly hold a hoe, shake his head in affectionate disbelief. On an August evening when the preserves were done and the children were asleep and the farmhouse was full of the smell of sugar and fruit, Chester came inside to find Letitia at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and he could see from the quality of her stillness that she was thinking about something. "What is it?" he asked. She looked up and smiled at him, and then the smile shifted into something that was more full. "Another one," she said. He sat down across from her and took her hands. "When?" "Spring, I think," she said. "March or April." He held her hands and looked at her with that expression she knew so well now, that particular combination of tenderness and certainty and the slight amazement of a man who had built his peace with not having this and then had been given it abundantly. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "I feel well," she said. "I feel very well." She squeezed his hands. "Are you all right?" "I am better than all right," he said, and his voice was quiet with it. "I am the luckiest man in Kansas." "You are the most hard-working man in Kansas," she said. "You can take some credit for what you have built here." "What we have built," he said. "What we have built," she agreed. Their third child, another son whom they named James Thomas Shelby, was born in April of 1886, a healthy and vehement boy who announced his arrival in the world with a voice that George Tillman, working in the nearest field, claimed to have heard clearly. Chester held him in the first hour, sitting in the chair beside the bed where Letitia was resting, and she watched him with the baby the way she always found herself doing, with a kind of quiet fullness that was beyond articulation. "He is going to be loud," Chester said, with the affectionate resignation of someone who had spent years on a farm and knew something about things that made a lot of noise being entirely necessary. "He is going to be himself," Letitia said, "whatever that turns out to be." Chester looked at her over the baby's head. "That is a very Letitia Rourke thing to say." "Letitia Shelby," she said. "Letitia Rourke Shelby," he said, "who is entirely herself whatever that turns out to be." She put her hand out toward him and he reached across and took it, with the baby quiet now in the crook of his other arm, and the spring light coming through the window of the farmhouse bedroom, and Caldwell going about its business 3 miles west, and the field stretching east, and everything exactly as it should be. Helen, the second teacher at the school, had proved herself entirely capable by 1887, and Letitia trusted her enough to take on more of the administrative burdens that Letitia had been carrying since the school expanded. This freed Letitia's time in a way that she used thoughtfully, spending part of it on the farm where there was always enough to be done, and part of it in writing letters to the Kansas State Board of Education about curriculum needs and resource allocation for frontier schools, letters which were sometimes ignored and sometimes were not, and the ratio was improving. George Tillman's family, which included his wife Martha and their 3 children, had settled into the small house on the eastern section of the Shelby property, built by Chester and George together over the course of 2 winters, and Martha and Letitia had developed a friendship that was one of the good ones. The kind built on mutual respect and genuine liking, and the practical solidarity of 2 women managing households and families in a place that required all the competence you had, and a fair amount you had to invent as you went. Caldwell itself had changed significantly by the late 1880s. The cattle trail era was effectively over. The town had diversified, had grown quieter in some ways and busier in others, had developed the kind of settled community feeling that replaces the raw energy of a frontier town when the frontier, strictly speaking, starts to recede. There were more families, more churches, more organizations, a small library that Letitia had been instrumental in establishing, and which she considered one of her finest professional achievements to date. In the fall of 1887, Chester had a conversation with Letitia about the future of the farm, specifically about whether to expand further east or to put their resources into improving what they had. They sat at the kitchen table for an entire evening with a lantern and a sheet of paper between them, the way they always worked through decisions of consequence, neither of them making anything unilateral, both of them trusting the other's thinking. "I think we improve what we have," Letitia said, after they had talked through the numbers. "The new section is producing, but it is not producing at the same rate as the original land. You know this land, Chester. Depth is better than breadth here." He considered this, turning his coffee cup. "You are probably right," he said. "George agrees with you, I think, though he has not said it directly." "George said I would focus on what is working when you showed him the map," Letitia said. "For George, that is very direct." Chester laughed, which was one of the sounds she had come to love the most, his actual laugh, which was warm and genuine and came from someone who did not perform amusement but felt it. "All right," he said. "Depth over breadth. We put the resources into the irrigation improvements and the new grain storage. And the porch repairs," she added. "The porch does not affect the crop yield," he said. "The porch affects my quality of life," she said serenely, "which affects everything." He looked at her with that affectionate, exasperated expression. "The porch," he said. "Thank you," she said. He reached across the table and tapped her hand lightly with 2 fingers, and she caught his hand and held it. By 1889, the year Kansas was firmly established in the post-frontier era, and the Shelby farm had completed its irrigation improvements and its porch repairs and its grain storage expansion. William was 9 years old, and learning his letters with the same intensity he brought to everything. Catherine was 6, and had started school in September with a composure that impressed even her mother, who had high standards in these matters. And James was 3, and had not diminished his conviction that the world owed him a thorough explanation of all its phenomena. Letitia was 35 and Chester was 41, and they had been married 10 years in April, which they acknowledged on a warm spring evening with the same quiet ceremony with which they had always acknowledged what mattered, sitting on the repaired porch with coffee, watching the fields, talking. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he agreed. That day seems very far and also very close, she said. Which day? The day I arrived, she said. Standing in that street with that ridiculous man reaching for my trunk and you leaning against the post saying nothing. I was trying to decide whether to say anything, he said. What made you decide? He thought about it for a moment, which she appreciated. He did not give quick answers to questions that deserved careful ones. Burke's face, he said finally. He had an expression that I recognized. A man who sees a woman and sees a problem to be managed. I have never been able to leave that kind of situation alone when I see it clearly. It changed my life, she said. Mine also, he said. She looked at him across the 10 years. He was more weathered now, the lines around his eyes deeper, his hair threaded with gray at the temples, and he was to her mind considerably more handsome for all of it, in the way of things that have been tested and have held. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Happier than I have ever been in my life," he said, without any hesitation at all, and she heard the truth of it, the complete and unperformed truth, and she set down her coffee cup and leaned over and kissed him on the jaw just there, where she had first put her fingers on a December night 7 years before. He turned and looked at her. 10 more years, she said. 10 more after that, he said. And the 10 after that, she said. He put his arm around her, and she settled against him on the repaired porch of the house that was theirs, their farm stretching east in the evening light, their children's voices drifting from inside the house where Mabel Cotter had come for the evening, so that Chester and Letitia could have this hour on the porch, this quiet and complete hour, which was its own kind of anniversary gift, freely given and deeply received. The stars came out over the Kansas plains in the gradual way they always did, first one and then several and then all at once in their impossible abundance. And the frogs sang from the creek, and somewhere to the east an owl called once, and everything that was theirs was present and intact and good. She thought about the girl she had been stepping down from a stagecoach with 2 valises and a determination that was mostly composed of nerve, and about the town that had presumed to assign her an escort, and about the man who had stepped forward not to replace that presumption, but to offer something entirely different, something without conditions, without expectations, without agenda. He had offered her a choice, her own choice, and she had made it, and she had kept making it every day since, which was, she thought, what love actually was. Not a thing that happened to you once, but a thing you chose over and over in the small decisions and the large ones, in the way you listened and the way you showed up and the way you said a person's name. "Chester," she said, just saying it. "Right here," he said, which was exactly right. Inside the house, William was explaining something to Catherine with great seriousness, and James had apparently knocked something off a shelf and was not bothered by this, and Mabel was managing all of it with the serene competence of someone who had raised 6 children and knew that noise was not the same as crisis. Letitia and Chester sat on the porch in the full Kansas night, with all of it, around them and between them and solid under their feet, and she thought that this was the thing you could not have predicted from any single moment. How a summer afternoon and a refused escort and a quiet man with steady hands could add up to something this complete. She had not wanted an escort. She had been absolutely right about that. She had wanted, though she had not known it then, someone who understood the difference between walking with a person and walking ahead of them, someone who would match her pace and trust her feet. She had found him. She held his hand in the dark, and the stars were extraordinary over the plains, and the farm was quiet, and their children were inside making their particular and beloved noise, and it was the year 1889 in the state of Kansas on a piece of good dark earth that they had built together, and there was nothing, not one single thing, that was unfinished or unresolved or left incomplete. It was whole. It was exactly, entirely, permanently whole.